All right, can everybody hear? Is it loud enough? Okay. We've been mentioning for several weeks that we wanted to give an emphasis to home and family life, marriage life. And so Luke will start Sunday morning for 6 weeks on lessons for the home. And I'll be in here now for 6 weeks looking at agape love, how it behaves. You know, we had a sermon a couple of weeks ago saying that, if you learn agape love and unconditional love and apply that to every human relationship, people are going to be all right, and our influence will be strong. And so what does that mean? We all know what agape love is. We've heard the term unconditional love. Well, what does that actually look like? And so we're going to be looking at, specifically, 1 Corinthians chapter 13, there, verses 4 down through verse 8. There are 15 identifying characteristics of love. And so we're going to go slow enough, and I'll revisit this when I take my time again. It's kind of rusty. I do a lot of preaching, but not as much teaching for adults. So I'm glad to be back in here for at least a little while, at least for the next 6 weeks, and then pick up on a rotational basis. So I'm glad to be back here with you. Why 1 Corinthians chapter 13? What was it like in the church at Corinth? What problem did they have? Might be easy to ask, what problem did they not have? I mean, about every kind of problem possible. What was Corinth like in that day? Anybody have any idea of what history was like? It's like Las Vegas of that day. I mean, to be called a Corinthian was about as big as insult as you could have. And as we know, baptism doesn't drown the devil. And so you have good desires and evil desires, and baptism is a starting point. You want to repent of things, but it takes a while for people to work through those issues. And there were a lot of issues for them to work through. What were some of the issues the church at Corinth had? Just kind of look at a background at what Paul was dealing with in this letter, why this love test was necessary. What kind of problems did the church at Corinth have? What was the first one? Anybody recall? The problem of division. Right after the first 9 verses of the salutation, he talks about, I hear there are divisions among you. And what other kind of issues do they have? Well, how about the Lord's Supper? 1 Corinthians chapter 11. How many times have we read that? What they were not gathering to do. And so they had to be corrected. How about tolerating sin in the camp? There's a passage there in the earlier part of 1 Corinthians, talking about chapter 5, where they had to deal with a specific situation. They were bragging about, arrogant in their love. They accepted this man as he was, a sinner. And that wasn't what they're supposed to be doing. And Paul gave them very specific instructions as to what to do and why to do those things. But in chapters 12 and 13 and 14, he deals with spiritual gifts. Why did they have, just to make sure we're all up to speed, why was it necessary for them to have spiritual gifts back then? To confirm the word. Well, what word did they have? And I've told this before. One of the very first door knocking campaigns I did was in Scott County, Kentucky, outside of Oneida, way out in the boonies. Went up on this front porch, and there was an older lady there. She has had the tobacco dripping down her chin. But she knew I was a church fellow because I had my Bible. She said, stop right there. What version of the Bible do you have? She wasn't even going to talk to me unless it was the King James Version. She said, I'll only talk to people who use the version that Peter preached out of on the day of Pentecost. So that was kind of a gross conceptual error. But they didn't have the New Testament. It took a while for them to get that. And so the end of the period, they would receive spiritual gifts that would provide the instruction that they needed to carry on. How would they get those gifts? By the laying on of the apostles' hands. We could look at Acts chapter 8 and see how that happened. And Paul talked about Timothy, how he got his gift by laying on of his hands. So that's the only way they got it. And when the apostles died, there was no other means to pass on to confer those spiritual gifts. And those people who had those spiritual gifts, when they died, what happened? Well, the spiritual gifts ended. By that time, what had been gathered together? The New Testament was there. The plan, the 7,956 verses, based on how you count, were there to provide the perfect standard. And so if you look at 1 Corinthians chapter 12, he deals with the problem of division. He lists specific spiritual gifts. There were certain spiritual gifts that they liked better than others. Anybody know which ones they preferred? They wanted to speak in tongues. They wanted the showy type gifts. They wanted to brag about it and so forth. I want you to look at the very last. Well, let's start with verse 28 of chapter 12, leading into chapter 13. Chapter 12, verse 28, to see the setting or context, if you will, of chapter 13. And God has appointed these in the church, first apostles, second prophets, third teachers, after that miracles, then gifts of healings, helps, administrations, varieties of tongues. Are all apostles? Are all prophets? Are all teachers? Are all workers of miracles? Do all have gifts of healing? Do all speak with tongues? Do all interpret? But earnestly desire the best gifts. And yet I show you a more excellent way. And what is that way? What's the way of love? And then he explains why that's so important. And let's read the first 3 verses in chapter 13 of 1 Corinthians. Though I speak with the tongues of men and of angels, but have not love, I become sounding brass or a clanging cymbal. And though I have the gift of prophecy, understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and though I have all faith so that I can remove mountains, have not love, what's it worth? I'm nothing. And though I bestow all my goods to feed the poor, and though I give my body to be burned, but have not love, it profits me nothing. And then he goes ahead and starts the list. Here's the way agape love performs. It does certain things. It refuses to do certain other things. Here's the first one that we'll examine tonight. Love suffers long and is kind. Love does not envy. It doesn't parade itself. It's not puffed up. Does not behave rudely. Does not seek its own. It's not provoked. Thinks no evil. Does not rejoice in iniquity, but rejoices in the truth. Bears all things. Believes all things. Hopes all things. Endures all things. There's 15, by the way, if you're counting. And then look at the very first phrase in chapter 15, 13, verse 8. Love never fails. But as a contrast, whether there are prophecies, what will happen to them? They will fail. The time would come. Whether there are tongues, they shall cease. Whether there is knowledge, is special knowledge by laying on the apostles' hands, it shall, what's going to happen to it? It's going to vanish away. For now we know in part and we prophesy in part, but when that which is perfect has come, then that which is in part will be done away with. What is that which is perfect? It's the New Testament. It's the Word of God. When they had it all, they wouldn't need the partial. So when I was a child, I spoke as a child, understood as a child, I thought as a child, but when I became a man, I put away childish things. For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, but then I shall know just as I'm also am known. And now abideth faith, hope, love, these 3, but the greatest is what? I wish they didn't stop. I know man put those chapters and verse divisions in there. Look at the very next words in chapter 14. What is it? Pursue love. So that's what they needed to do. Instead of fighting and arguing about the spiritual gifts, because one day, the day's coming, all that's going to be gone. But what do they need to concentrate on? Learning how to love. And so that's what we want to be able to do. So if we learn how to love, it doesn't matter what human relationship we're in. Now we want to apply it to home life, a marriage. Why there first? Why should Christianity and these aspects of love be applied first at home? Why should it be applied first at home? Anybody got any idea? I mean, that's where you have to start, because children, you're there for so many years. If they don't learn how to love by the time they leave home, then where are they going to learn it? Going to learn it from who? From the world. The world's track record isn't very impressive. But how about husband and wife? Most marriages are started out with the think and the expectation everything will go great. But 2 or 3 years later, after the wow phase is gone, most marriages kind of settle into something far beneath what they expected. Why is that? Why don't most marriages have the passion that lasts the way it does during the time when you're dating? What's missing? They don't know how to love. Well, they learned enough about love to get married. What was different about pre-marriage ceremony and after the honeymoon? Because normally how people, what kind of behavior do they get during their dating? You get the best. Is that not the case? Honey, where do you want to go eat? What do you want to do tonight? And all that. You think that's the way the question's always asked through 50 years of marriage? That's not the way that it works. And so what happens? They find out, you get in the discovery phase and find out, whoa, I didn't know he was like that, she was like that. He gets upset, she gets upset. And unless you have this agape love where you can suffer long, you get mad, you're hurt. And when somebody hurts you, even someone that you love, you expect the best. And when you don't get the best, then what is a normal response of someone in a marriage? Are they now as close at the end of the day? She gets angry. They say marriage is 50-50. Let's say they start out right here. After the honeymoon, they're as close as they can possibly be. He blows it first, and she remembers it. You think she might back up a little bit? He sees that. What does he do? As these things happen, I call it the tit for tat, and after about 3 or 4 years of that, where are they? They're pretty far apart. What does it take to keep that from happening? It requires a lot of what? W-O-R-K. What kind of work? Well, the kind of work we're talking about. Because is it the very first one listed? I know you can probably already see the handout. What's the first one listed? Love suffers long. That's naturally the way you grew up, isn't it? No, that's not what people do. How long is how much patience does the average person have with people? Well, how would you, I guess a lot of it depends on, sometimes by personality, people have been more aggressive and more laid back than others. But, when I grew up, pretty much, the way you won an argument in the Bryan household, there's 6 of us kids, whoever yelled the loudest and the longest usually won. That's not a good way of, how about applying that to marriage? Is that good? I mean, my parents were not church people growing up. They became Christians as adults, but they didn't start out. And many of the habits and value systems that we have, how soon do we get them? How soon does an average person begin to put together his value system? You wait till you're 25? No. When does it start to be put together? You can ask teachers in school. If you don't have certain principles ingrained in that child by the time he's 8, 9, 10 years old, what are you going to have? I mean, pretty much what they're going to be in personality and temperament, most people say, is by the time you're 9 or 10. Why is that? Why is that? And that's true, because that's where the foundation starts. And so what you are who you are pretty much by the time you're 4th grade. And what's 5th grade, 6th grade, 7th grade high school do? It just reinforces the conclusions that you've made and the values you've drawn. What are the value systems wrong? Then good luck. Life is going to be hard, and then you'll end up, in Corinth, when there wasn't a whole lot of good environments, then it was going to be tough. And so the application for this is for everybody. So how hard is it to develop this agape love? It requires a lot of work. Here's the work I want you to do. Now, I'm going to teach this tonight. We're going to highlight. There'll be handouts for every one of them. I've got all of them done. 15 handouts, 1 page for each of them. But what does it take for this lesson to be yours? Now, I wrote the lesson. I preached it here years ago. I give these copies to my students at school because they want them. But what would it take for my lesson to become your lesson? What would it take? Just hearing it one time up here? That's not going to work. You have to do what? Let me ask you to do this. I'm going to ask you to show hands. How many of you, I know sometimes schedules get crazy, but let me ask you to do this. Between now and next Wednesday night, get this outline out, read over the points, and look at the verses on your own. What would be the advantage of that? Over just listening to it one time. Because now, see, you're getting my part. You're getting some good out of it, but that's not enough to make it yours. Yes, Lee. Say it again. There it is. Now, it helps to, there's different ways that the information comes in. There's, some people, how many of you are good at digging things out on your own? Most people aren't like that. I know people that have to hear it. I know people that, like in school of preaching and the Navy and so forth, they did get together in a study group. They talk about it. They go over the questions with each other. How do they best learn? They learn by listening. And so some of you, I don't know what your chosen method is, but I know this. If you take this handout and read over these notes a couple of times and look at the passages of Scripture, that's going to help you. But when will it really be yours? If you don't make the application to your own life, what good is it going to do? What's Psalm 1 about? I appreciate Donnie going through the Psalms. I mean, the Psalms talk about devotional things. I know somebody told me after Nancy died that I didn't have the desire to start reading the Psalms. You need to think great thoughts about God. So that's it. How does Psalm 1 begin? Anybody know? Look at it. Look at the first couple of verses. Somebody read it for me. Psalm 1. The very first Psalm. Don't be bashful. See, if you read the Psalms, if you volunteer to read, I won't ask you the questions. That's pretty smart. Go ahead. I think. Go ahead and read it, Pat. Read the first three verses. Let's look at verse 1 real quick. Notice the progression. Who walks not in the counsel. If something bad is going on, say you're out there with your son or so forth, and you see something bad going on, what should you do? Walk right on by. That's the first thing. What's the second step? Let's stop. You stop and listen to it. Now, how much are you absorbing of what you shouldn't be? How about taking a seat? Now what are you doing? See, that's what happens to sin. It's progression. To battle that, what do we do in verse 2? Your delight is in what? And in His law, what do you do day and night? What does that mean? What does it mean to actually meditate? How would you meditate on 1 Corinthians 13, these love tests? What does that actually entail, meditating? Okay, you think about it, you pray about it, you see, first of all, I've got it written as a love test. There are 15 questions in this test. And so what we want you to do is ask yourself, each one of these, am I someone who suffers long? And if you're not, who here is hitting 100% of the maximum suffering? I mean, you got the greatest patience in all the world with people. Anybody up there? So if we're not, what do we know that we need to be doing? See, there's progress to be made, but where? Maybe you're one of the most patient people you know in your house. Well, I don't have to worry about that one. Is that the way you should be? No, what do you do? What do you do? But see, the reason why I say start first, how many, if you attend every service, how many hours together are we? Sunday night, Wednesday night, Sunday morning, how many hours is that? 4 hours. How many hours are you at home? Do the math. So I'm just saying, if you need to work on patience and have suffered long. It's true. We need to make the application of brother. But how much, if people are going to get upset, how often is that upset have to do with family? Or the issues families having to face? I mean, that's just reality. And then now kids especially, when they're growing up, until they get out and get a real job, why do they get, when especially get about 15 or 16-year-old, why do they get frustrated with mom and dad all the time? Well, they got a limited spirit. They got their friends at school, and their friends like at school think all the same. And they all, it's a kind of conspiracy against mom and dad when you get about 15. And you think all the parents are all messed up. And so you see all the faults. You think kids at 16 will see more of the good or more of the bad. They're going to pick you apart. If anything, they don't, especially if you tell them no when they're looking for a yes. They want this, and you say no, when you have to go to work and all kinds of things you don't expect. You don't get to live the life that you want to live. Everybody else is living on the street at 16. I mean, now what kind of position are you with your parents? But what is getting a job and going out in the world help? Anybody here ever have a child and say, "You're not so bad after all," when you find out what other people are like this? I'm just saying, you've got all kinds of time at home to apply this in marriage and with your children. So since you've got the time element, find first, and then certainly with the brethren, we need to be applying that, and then the neighbors and so forth. So I'm just saying, the reason why I'm saying make sure it works at home is because you've got all kinds of time. What is the home kind of a laboratory for what works, what doesn't work? Any of you change your mind on things about raising your kids? Any of you finally able to convince your father to change his mind about some things? My brother Kenny had it made. Because my father, he was raised without a father, and he was raised pretty much by grandmother, who he said was the meanest woman on the face of the earth. And I tell you, he couldn't do anything with her. When the day after he graduated from high school in June of 42, got a bus and left home. So when he started plopping out all these kids, and I was the first one, how tight do you think the rules were? Right now, I'd have been kicked out of the house a long time ago. Anybody remember how long hair was in 1969? The hippie movement had already started, not where I lived. If my hair touched my ears, my dad threatened to take my car away, which meant I was going to end up in Vietnam. I was going to school, working my way through school, and he was serious about that. If I was late if I wasn't home at 12 o'clock as a freshman, as a sophomore, got to move to 12:30. If I was 5 minutes late, it was going to be the end of the world. But guess how long Kenny's hair was? 6 years later, his hair was down on his shoulders. I couldn't even get my driver's license until I was almost 18. You know when Kenny got his driver's license? 16. He already had a 69 Camaro, 396, 4-speed. It's not fair. So I paved the way. Kenny's life was a whole lot better. What did my father learn? You know what my mother said? You run the first one off, you join the Navy, you're not going to run the rest of them off. Ease up. So I'm just saying we have to learn what works and what doesn't work. And the Bible has to be the guide for that. I'm just saying you have to find the application. So to make sure we get everything out of this, what do we need to do? Do the homework. Yes, Joanne. Yeah. Fear is a pretty good motivator. Yeah. Well, any of you have a parent that whatever they promised, they delivered? I mean, my mom and dad were both that way. So if they said you're going to get a whipping when you get home, it doesn't matter how eloquent you were, what's going to happen? I'm just saying, so we had parents, and I'm just saying, this. But what this is about is making sure we understand. Agape love will fix what? Is the Christianity about relationships? Is Christianity the one another religion? Can you give me some verses that talk about one another? I was about 16. We could rattle off love one another, pray for one another, forgive one another, encourage one another, comfort one another. I mean, those things are there. So Christianity involves each other. And at Corinth, they weren't doing that. And so that's the reason why chapter 13 is there. Let's look at the notes. Here's the way that each one of these outlines will be formed. I'll define it first of all, and then that's in A. We'll look to see what's involved with that. And number B, we'll look at models of it. And then C, how do you make the application? So we're going to go through this pretty quick. We only got about 10 minutes and 5 seconds left. Love suffers long, is patient. Number A, there are a number of people, problems in life that have no easy solutions. Everybody understand that? If you've got people, what do you have? If you've got moral-minded people, what do you have? If you've got immoral-minded people, what do you have? How much have you been upset over the last 6 months had to do with people? You might have had a sorry car, but most of our being happy, upset has to do with people and problems. Here's the problem with patience. We have one timetable. How long is God's? How long? Did you ever notice a difference? Normally when because if you're smart growing up, maybe in the church you realize, problems are going to happen. But generally, here's the problem. When things start happening bad, after a while, we expect things to get easier, do we not? And if it doesn't get easier with a certain amount of time, then what happens? See, that's where the problem comes in. So my point is, where's your starting point? Anybody know somebody that's got an anger issue? How'd that happen? Here's the problem sometimes when somebody's got an anger issue, anger management problem. Somebody will say something, they'll get mad, and everybody will blame the last, well, he set them off. No, this is just the tipping point. What's in there already? Why is he mad? What temperature does water boil at sea level? 212 degrees. If you got a temperature, you're sitting at 210 degrees, normally, how much does it take to get you to boil over? At 2 more degrees, that won't be much. He looked at me wrong, and next thing you know, I'm just saying, as a Christian, especially if we got that issue, why is that 210 degrees there? What do we have to do? Take away the heat. But first of all, that has to be the commitment, I am going to do this. Because this is what God wants me to do. He wants me to be patient. The easiest thing to do, number one, is to break off relationships with people who possess these problems. But Christianity is not a religion that severs relationships, is it? Instead, it brings people together and tends to keep them together. The word translated patient, I'm going to ask you this next week, is from what Greek word? Macrothemeo. Can you say it with me? Macrothemeo. Macrothemeo. It literally means to be long-tempered. In other words, to have a long fuse. Anybody watch Westerns growing up? There was always dynamite around for a mine and so forth. And if you got dynamite, how long would you expect the fuse to be? If you're lighting it, you got to get out of the mine, a long fuse. If you got a short fuse, what happens? I learned real quick about what happens with a short fuse. Anybody here shoot off firecrackers when you're growing up? Anybody ever get a cherry bomb in your hand? When I was growing up, we had these older guys, and they let me and Steve and Johnny, we didn't know what we were doing, gave us some cherry bombs. And I didn't notice they had a real short fuse. I set mine off first. You know where the thing went off? In my hand. I'm bleeding like crazy. So, so I'm just saying, if you got a short fuse, what can happen? Well, it can hurt my hand, but if you got a short fuse, what can happen to life? So if you're going to be someone who suffers long, you got to determine to have not a short fuse, but so you need to be praying for what? To be long-tempered, to have a long fuse. The Greek word applies to people, not things. It's a love that does not retaliate and get even, but isn't that the American way? What movies do we like? What do we like Clint Eastwood? What's the famous line? Go ahead and make we love movies, and we all like seeing somebody get even, the revenge motive. There are people that's in charge of that. It's a love that doesn't give up. It's committed for the long haul. This is a quality that's unique. And look at this point number 4. This is a quality back in the first century that was unique. In the first century world, revenge was one of the greatest virtues. Somebody messed you over, what should you do? Get even or get ahead. It showed your strength and made you a hero, still in some circles today. Back then, man, so Christianity, when it taught agape love, suffering long, that went against the grain. Nobody was like that back then. But the church has to be things that we're not. The importance of patient love is seen in another. Look at Ephesians 4, verse 2 real quick. Ephesians 4, verse 2. The first 3 chapters of Ephesians gives you a great insight into what God has done for the church, the wisdom behind it. But in chapter 4, you have the transition, chapters 4, 5, and 6. Now, based on what God has done, here's what you are to do. And look at the first three verses that come out. If you appreciate being a member of the church, here's what you do. I, therefore, the prisoner of the Lord, beseech you to walk worthy of the calling with which you're called. What does that mean? With all lowliness and gentleness, with what? Long-suffering, bearing with one another in love. Galatians chapter 5, verse 22. Anybody know what that is without looking at it? There are fruits of the Spirit. Is patience one of them? It's one of them. So I'm just saying that we're looking at this passage here, but there are a lot of other passages in the Bible where you can find that. The models of patience, we'll quickly look at. How about God's patience? I've given you one verse. 2 Peter 3, verse 9, the Lord is not slack concerning his promise, as some count slackness, but is long-suffering toward us, not willing that any should perish, that all should come to what? To repentance. Now, I've given you a verse here. Give me a couple of examples, or at least one, of what you think is God being patient from the Bible. Bible examples of God being patient. There you go. How about Israel? How much patience did it take for God to be patient with Israel? I mean, he made it all of it. And after Joshua's generation, how long did it take before they started to blow it? Didn't take long. But see, now, what was Moses' problem leading for 40 years? In fact, he didn't get to go to the promised land because what happened one day? He got mad. He got hot. Supposed to speak to the rock. He had, as my dad said, a conniption fit. Smote the rock. He got water, but he paid the price for that. But a righteous, patient God was trying to tell him, you don't do that. Do things as I ask. How about Jesus' patience on the cross? Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. How about Stephen's patience? When he was being stoned to death, what did he say? I don't see how he did that. Anybody see how tough that would be? Anybody ever had a rock thrown to hit you in the head? I mean, growing up, you've surely gotten rock fights. It hurts. And that's how they killed him. People who hated his guts because he was a Christian. And laid out the history of Israel for those people. But they wouldn't have it. What can we do that will help us be more patient with people? Now, we won't have time to look at all these passages, but this is what hopefully you'll get started on. Make the New Testament your standard. Don't allow the shortcomings of others to justify your own. There's a great passage in Romans chapter 12. Vengeance is God's business, not yours. Why does God say, I'm not going to give you the permission to do that. I got that. Why does God demand it be that way? Why does God say, I'm the one in the vengeance business, not you? What's that? It's supposed to be Christ-like. Because if he did put you in charge, you think you'd do it as good as God? Or is there certain times better than others for vengeance? Is there certain ways better than others? You all know about that? You don't. God does. And so if somebody causing all kinds of problems, then what do? If it's a Christian, you can look down at the bottom. If somebody is causing problem for you as a Christian and they are sinning, what do Christians do? If this person doesn't come to their understanding, I'm sinning, what do you do? What's the recourse? Matthew chapter 18 requires you to do what? Go resolve that. You go first to him and him alone, that you may gain your brother. That doesn't work, you take 2 or 3 more witnesses, that every word may be established. If that doesn't work, you tell it to the whole church. That's one thing. Galatians 6:1. If somebody's blown it in the church, anybody know what that says? Rather, if any man be overtaken in a fault, you which are spiritual, go seek to restore such a one. So I'm just saying there's a process for doing that. James chapter 3 talks about the tongue. So first of all, if you've done everything that you can do, and the church has done everything they can do, give it to God. Put him in charge. Go on with your life. Let him deal with it. How about develop the right attitude towards patience? James chapter 1, what's the right attitude? This is the hard part. James chapter 1, verses 2 through 4. One of the hardest passages in all of Scripture. Let's look at it. What's the right attitude towards trials that come? Somebody read that for me real quick. We've got about 2 minutes left. What's that? But read it real quick. Count it all joy, my brethren, you have all these divers temptations, knowing that the trying of your faith worketh patience, but let patience have her perfect work, that you might be what? So from that passage, what's the attitude? Now, nobody likes it when the stuff is coming, incoming, the storms and all that, but what should your mind be on? Real quick, what do you got to latch on? If God's allowing this, there's what? There's something to learn that I don't have already. Here's the question I want you to ponder. We'll start the discussion next week. Should every Christian be praying for patience? Should they? I'm seeing a lot of heads going up and down. Here's the question. Are you? I've heard people say, boy, I don't pray for patience, because what happens? What happens? What will God do? Turn up the heat? Okay, he's asking for it. Put him at the front of the line. Is there another way of learning some patience, by the way, as we close? Romans 15, verse 4, as we close. Things written before time were written for our learn that we through the comfort and patience of the Scriptures might have what? Might have hope. So, is it best to learn it from the Bible? By looking at the examples of Joseph, of Job, of Moses, of Noah? If you don't learn it there, what's option B for the Lord? In other words, it's you can take it the easy way, or you can take it the hard way. So, our time is up. We appreciate you being here and your good attention. Keep this with you. Please go through and look at the notes one more time, and then we'll start after the discussion praying for patience. And those of you that had the courage to do that, what happened? So we'll start there next time. Appreciate you all. Thank you.